Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 11 of What If Naruto was in Rosario Vampire. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see part 12 of it, comment down below and let me know. And go ahead and check out other What Ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. Sealing away the Uchiha Madara definitely wasn't as easy as it may have sounded. Naruto dodged out of the way as the Uchiha Susanoo brought its blue, ethereal blade down upon him. The weapon slammed into the sand with a thundering crash, spraying sand everywhere. Naruto ignored it in favor of jumping straight at the Susanoo's helmeted skull, a golden chakra arm aiding him in creating a Rasengan with an addition of 4 rapidly spinning wind blades. Instead of trying to shove it into the being's face, Naruto reared his hand back before rocketing it forward, sending the shuriken-like ball of spinning chakra soaring. Naruto's aim held true, and the technique slammed straight into the Susanoo's skull, creating a large sphere of powerful winds that shredded the armor in that area. When Naruto had landed, he was around halfway down the massive crater the Susanoo was standing in. He looked up just as the sphere of dangerous wind dissipated. The blue helmet of Madara's Susanoo began to crack and peel off in some spots. The pieces that did come off disintegrated into nothing before they could touch anything. Madara himself, however, was still just as calm as he always was. He was staring down at Naruto with his purple and rippled eyes, silently challenging him to hold his promise of sealing him away. Naruto gritted his teeth. It seemed like he'd need more power than just a cloak of Kurama's chakra, and there was only one way to get that. Sukune was sure that if Gin wasn't there, he'd be dead, or at least have broken bones. The two stood at the end of the corridor, right next to the door that used to hold the keys to the prison cells. Ishigami was slumped on the wall next to Gin, still unconscious from the werewolves earlier, and lightning-fast victory over her. Alarms blared in their ears, and around a short 5 meters in front of them was what Sukune would describe as chaos. All throughout the corridor there was yokai, a lot of them public safety committee members, and an equal amount of them were the now former prisoners. It hadn't been an easy task to set them free, as quite a number of them had been driven near or past the point of insanity, and it was Sukune's luck that Gin could be a rather imposing figure. He felt a small urge to help the prisoners fight the public safety committee members, but he held himself back for 2 reasons. 1, for the fact that he wouldn't actually be able to do anything, and 2, the formerly imprisoned yokai deserved their chance of getting back at the ones who had locked them up. Sukune was sure that Gin felt something similar. Gin grabbed the back of his head and forced him down onto his knees. Above him, he heard something slam uselessly against the brick wall, before seeing it clang onto the ground right next to him, an iron bar from one of the cells. He gulped, stood back up, and gave Gin a grateful nod. Thanks. Don't mention it. The werewolf didn't take his eyes away from the battle royale and only nodded. Some of the yokai had transformed into their true forms, their hulking figures demolishing everything in the way. Sukune could also hear the fight between Naruto, Milka, and Kaio going on in the distance. Someone was thrown above all the fighting yokai and slammed into the floor, sliding in Sukune and Gin's direction. 3 weird and slimy-looking tentacles were impaled in his chest, and his mouth was almost completely covered in his own blood. The yokai coughed weakly, another spurt of blood erupting and coating his face in crimson. He was in ragged pants, and was without a shirt, showing that he definitely wasn't a member of the public safety committee. The tentacles seemed to stiffen, and before Tsukune knew what was going on, the yokai on the ground was mercilessly ripped apart, allowing everyone to see that on the end of the tentacles was hundreds of thick, pole-like structures pointing in separate directions. Blood flew through the air along with organs, bones, half of a leg, and of course there just had to be an eyeball added into the mix. They slapped against the wall, ceiling and floor with a sound like someone had just done a belly flop in the deep end. The fighting in the corridor paused as most of the yokai just stared at where the death had happened, with the only sounds being Naruto's distant fight. Suddenly, a loud and satisfied voice broke through. Ha! That's what you get for taunting me for all these years, bastard. The thick, pole-like structures receded back into the tentacles that began moving into the crowd until they were attached to a teen with bulging muscles. It was with a start that Sukune realized the teen wasn't someone from the public safety committee, it was one of the former prisoners. Why would he? Sukune began, but trailed off when all the yokai began fighting once again, as if they had pushed what had happened to the back of their minds. Sukune was completely taken off guard by what had happened. He thought that it was simply a battle of prisoners versus committee, but apparently some prisoners had grudges against others who were supposed to be on the same team. He felt numb as he looked at Gin, to see a hard expression on his face. The werewolf didn't turn to look at him, but he must have noticed Sukune looking in his direction, because he spoke up. What's wrong, Sukune? He asked, but Sukune got the feeling that he wasn't supposed to answer. Why are you so surprised? Things like this happen at this school every day. But he just... What? Killed him? Took him out? Yeah, he did. He probably enjoyed it too. Gin sighed and leaned more into the wall. It's just the way the world is for yokai. It's in a yokai's nature to be bloodthirsty, and some of us even see it as a way to relieve stress. His tone was nostalgic, as if he'd been exactly like he described. But you already know this, right? Yeah, of course. Tsukune slumped against the wall and gulped down the sick feeling he had. Things started to pass on in a blur from there. The two sides kept fighting, blood coated the corridor, Yuki permeated the air, the surroundings were destroyed, bodies hit the floor like Dave Williams, and the sound of bones breaking was basically a constant. Tsukune didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed like only minutes when he realized that the prisoners were not only pushing the committee members back, but were basically slaughtering them. So you've noticed? Gin asked and dragged Tsukune's attention over to him. There isn't anyone that the Public Safety Committee has killed yet, they've only knocked Yokai unconscious. Yeah. Tsukune didn't tear his eyes away from the battle. There was corpses of committee members in dozens, but any prisoners that were on the ground were still at least breathing. But why? They don't have permission, Gin said. That's why they're holding back, they're not allowed to go all out. If they were, then this would have ended ages ago with a completely different result. He ran a hand through his hair. It's also why we, or at least why I'm not, interfering. The committee brought this on themselves, and now they're about to pay the consequences. And what will happen afterwards? The remaining yokai will probably leave the school, and those that don't, well, I don't know, but the headmaster will probably be in a bad mood. Tsukune wasn't going to reply, but before he could even think to himself, a loud boom resounded through the area, followed by several others that got closer and closer until they stopped to his left. The remaining yokai didn't seem to pay any attention to it, and continued on with their task. Gin sniffed the air. It's Moka-san and Kaio. He nodded to the door that led to the room he'd been ambushed by a Shigami in. Naruto just arrived too. Tsukune somehow managed to stand on his shaky legs with a weak smile on his face. Let's go say hi then. When he had opened the door, it was just in time to hear Naruto say, freeing a bunch of crazy yokai from imprisonment can't have been enjoyable. Tsukune blinked, taking in the room. Kaio was slumped against a badly bent locker, his form slowly but surely shifting back into his human one. Moka was on the opposite side of a yokai, leaning on a locker with her arms crossed, and an interested expression on her face directed at the blonde who had his back to them. In the side of the room there was a glaringly obvious and gaping hole in the wall. No, it wasn't enjoyable. Gin said from over his shoulder, the height he had over Tsukune easily letting him speak without it being awkward. Naruto turned around with his usual carefree smile. Ah, you're fine. That's great. His eyes were bloodshot, and Tsukune was reminded of the time Naruto had watched those 3 gut-wrenching Saw movies in a row which had caused him to get a similar reaction. Yeah, fine. Tsukune muttered. I think it's about time we leave though, the prisoners are almost finished. Naruto's smile became grim, but he didn't look like he'd want to change what had happened to the committee if he was given the chance. Come on then, let's go get Yukari-chan and get out of here. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, Naruto's eyes widened, and an uncharacteristically shocked expression came upon his face. Before Tsukune could ask what was wrong, Naruto had barreled past him and Gin and out into the corridor where the unconscious Ishigami was. When Tsukune had managed to pick himself up and walk out to the blonde, Ishigami was gone, as if she had never been there in the first place. Where's Ishigami? Naruto's hands balled into fists and Tsukune could almost hear him grinding his teeth. Gone. He hissed out. She's gone with. Naruto trailed off, seeming like he didn't want to admit who had taken the former teacher, or he just didn't want anyone else to know who had been there. Either way, Tsukune didn't want to meet whoever it was, if they could cause such a reaction from Naruto, just by being there. What did you want to know? Naruto sighed, leaning against the vertical steel bars on top of the roof that prevented students from jumping off or falling from the building. The moon crescent-shaped moon was high in the sky, giving him and anyone else that was still awake some light. Moka, the silver-haired kick-ass one, stood in front of him, arms crossed with a somewhat annoyed expression. Why? Elaborate. Why do you always, you know? He held up her rosary in his hands to show what he meant. Go back to being sealed up all the time. She furrowed her silver eyebrows and her eyes glazed over, as if she was trying to think of, or remember the answer to that question. It only lasted a second, though before she snapped her attention back to him. That's none of your business. Naruto frowned at her cold dismissal, and a pause before her words. You don't even know the answer, do you? Her facial expression didn't change, but her body stiffened subtly, like she'd been caught elbow deep in the cookie jar. The reason is irrelevant, all that I know is that it's important. Naruto waited to see if she would continue, but she didn't, and if she did know more about why, then she seemed to be remaining stubborn and unmoving, just like his Susanoo had been earlier that day. Fine. He got off the steel bars, and gave her a carefree smile that he hoped hid his disappointment. He held the rosary out to her, and she took it from him. One last thing before I go, Uzumaki, she said, staring pointedly at his neck that was shown to the world as he didn't have his blazer on, though he had no idea where it had gone in the first place. You owe me compensation. He rolled his eyes, and tilted his head to the side, idly loosening his tie, as if it was an everyday chore. Yeah, go for it. The current Mocha wasn't as warm or welcoming as the one with pink hair, so he wasn't very surprised when she didn't fling herself at him and instead put her hands on his shoulders before digging her fangs into his neck. He was tempted to grab onto her hips to keep her steady just out of reflex, but he got the feeling she wouldn't appreciate it and kept his hands to himself. When she finished, she removed her fangs, licked away any excess blood, and stepped away from him. Until next time. She connected the rosary back onto the links above her chest, and the strong yoki she had been releasing dwindled down into a much smaller amount almost instantly. Mocha's hair turned pink, her eyes turned green, her hips and bust decreased in size, and her entire body fell forward. Naruto grabbed a hold of her before she could have an unwelcome confrontation with the roof, before hefting her up into his arms, so he was carrying her bridal style. This whole two-personality thing is really troublesome, you know that. He looked down at the asleep vampire, but only received a light snore as a response. He shook his head, before concentrating on the seal he'd left on top of the boys' dorm building. He briefly felt like he was being sucked into a wormhole piece by piece, but it didn't last long, and he soon found himself on a completely different roof, looking over at the girls' dorm building that was right next door. He was about to make a leap over there but stopped himself as something came to mind. Ah crap, I don't even know what room she's in. That's just like you. A slightly condescending, amused and deep voice told him. You're never one step ahead because you plan, you're always one step ahead because you skipped the previous step. Stuff it, you. What? I was going to call you an oversized plush toy, but it seems cliché, and way too easy of an insult. He mused and the Biju snorted. He shrugged his shoulders, and began walking to the side of the building. Oh well, I guess she can sleep in my room for the night. When he reached the side of the building he kept walking, channeling chakra into the soles of his shoes to keep him stuck to the side of the building. He'd already grown accustomed to not using his door since it had been replaced after he'd booted it down, and almost hit Sukune in the process, so it wasn't any trouble to find his window despite the awkward angle. He gently moved Mocha onto his shoulder and held her in place with his left hand, while his right one slid the window up and open. The sheet of glass was a decent size, and he was able to easily maneuver his body inside, even while carrying the sleeping vampire. He moved over to his futon and placed the teen down carefully, so he didn't wake her before grabbing the blanket and throwing it over her. He stood back up, cracked his back, put his hand over his mouth, and yawned. Sleep was the #1 priority on his mind at the moment. He shuffled along his carpeted floors towards his wardrobe that was only a few feet away and opened it. He pushed the clothes that were hanging there to the side, and grabbed a spare futon, blanket and pillow that had been neatly packed in there since the first day he'd even gotten in the room. He pulled them out, closed the wardrobe, set the futon down next to the one Mocha was on, put the pillow down and laid back on it, before bringing the blanket over himself. He released one last yawn before the sweet darkness of sleep consumed him. It seemed like only minutes had passed when Naruto was awoken to knocking on his door. He reluctantly opened his eyes and looked over at the digital clock on his kitchen bench. He scowled in annoyance. Who the hell would knock on my door at 3 in the morning? He threw the blanket that was covering him away and got up, idly noting that he hadn't even bothered to change out of his clothes before. He stormed over to the door and ripped it open, a slight snarl already locked and loaded in preparation for the one who dared to wake him up. It turned out to be Tsukune still in his school clothes on the other side of the door, with his arm raised and hand balled into a fist, as if he was preparing to knock again. Despite Tsukune being his friend, he couldn't find it in him to keep his annoyance in check. What the hell are you doing here? He snapped quietly, mindful of the vampire still asleep in his room. He must have had a pretty fierce and annoyed expression, because Tsukune took a step back and raised his hands in a placating manner. Wow, calm down. Naruto felt like shouting at him that he wanted to sleep and not calm down, but kept his tongue and settled for glaring at him. Tsukune straightened, apparently getting to the reason as to why he'd come. Naruto, can we have a talk? Why right now? Naruto looked him over, reining in his annoyance with a decent amount of effort. And why are you still awake at this hour? Ah. Tsukune scratched at his cheek with his index finger and chuckled. I couldn't sleep so I decided to play some games, but that's not why I came here, and yes it needs to be now. Well, I've got my mind made up. Naruto sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. We'll get on with it. Tsukune swallowed. Naruto, I want you to teach me how to use chakra. The next time Naruto woke it was to the smell of food and the noise of pots boiling. He opened his eyes blearily, blinking in an effort to get rid of the blurriness that was always annoyingly there whenever he woke up. He sat up and looked around. His room was normal, everything was in place, apart from Mocha who was standing in the kitchen busying herself with the pots on the stove. He gave her a once-over. She'd apparently gone back to her own room before he woken up, because instead of the school uniform that she'd slept in she wore a red blouse, a black mid-thigh length skirt, and over that was a white, frilly apron. He covered his mouth and yawned before standing up and stretching. Ah, morning Naruto-kun. He glanced over to his kitchen to see Mocha leaning on the bench and smiling at him. Morning, Mocha-chan. he said with a half-hearted wave before he began making his way over to the white door, making sure to grab his backpack before entering. Just going to have a shower, I'll be out in like 10 minutes or something. He wasn't keeping count on how long he'd been in there, but it hadn't felt majorly long, 10 or so minutes, like he'd said. He felt rejuvenated, fresh, clean and much more awake than he was before. He zipped up his jeans and pulled his shirt over his head, before grabbing his dirty school clothes and the towel he'd use, and shoving them in the corner of the bathroom, making a mental note to wash them later. Almost as soon as he'd opened the door, his stomach rumbled as he was mercilessly attacked by the grand smell of food. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't really care. There was only one focus he had right now, and that was satisfying his stomach. Breakfast's ready. Milka smiled as she put plates and bowls on the bench with freshly made food in them: steamed white rice, miso soup, takuin, as well as grilled fish. It didn't matter that Raymond wasn't there. He grabbed the chopsticks and eagerly dug into the bowl that was closest to him, which just so happened to be the rice. He disregarded the slight taste of grass and slowed down exceptionally after the first few mouthfuls. There was no need to choke himself to death on rice. So, he tapped the chopsticks on the side of the bowl before looking up at the vampire. His smile had gotten smaller with amusement. "Why did you decide to cook for me on this Saturday morning?" It may have sounded a bit rude and ungrateful, but it wasn't meant that way. He was just curious, and didn't want to play around with politeness, when he was already on rather familiar terms with her. She didn't take it the wrong way. "Well, I woke up here early this morning and just decided to make you some breakfast." She tilted her head to the side, frowning worriedly. "Why? Is it really that bad?" Naruto shook his head. "No, it's good and all, I was just wondering." He swallowed another mouthful of rice. "Why aren't you eating any, though?" Milka looked at his neck and her smile turned bloodthirsty, literally. "I think I've already got mine all prepared." He rolled his eyes. "I shouldn't have bothered asking, huh?" "No, not really." Sukune was laying down on his back on his futon, staring at his ceiling as he waited for Naruto to arrive. After he told Naruto last night, or very early in the morning, whichever one, that he wanted to learn how to use chakra, the blonde had told him that he'd be around tomorrow after he got some sleep. He felt like a bit of a jerk for waking him at that hour, but he had to tell him then. Well, his mind had been made up, otherwise he might have changed his decision. He glanced over the desk in the corner of his room, which had his laptop resting on it. He could start up that new MMO he'd been getting into, but he didn't really want to get lost in it, only to have Naruto arrive and kick his door open when he got there, so he just closed his eyes and sighed. It turned out that he didn't have to wait much longer until there was a knock on his door. He felt something swell inside of him when he got up and walked over. Eagerness, excitement. He didn't know, but he tried to push it down. He pulled the door open and found Naruto standing there with his hands in the pockets of his jeans. A dark orange t-shirt covered his torso, and a pair of Converses were covering his feet. "You going to let me in, or what?" The question made him blink back to reality. With a start he realized that he'd been standing in the same spot and doing nothing. "Nice going, Sukune." "Ah, yeah." He moved out of the way and closed the door once Naruto had entered. "What took you so long anyway?" "Milka-chan was making breakfast when I woke up," Naruto replied as he glanced around the room. "Why was she in your room before you were awake?" Naruto walked over to the desk and took a seat on the chair backwards, spinning it around so he was facing him. "She stayed the night." He shrugged like it didn't bother him in the least. "Why? Is it a problem?" "No, not at all." Sukune resisted the urge to roll his eyes. It was just like Naruto, to not be embarrassed in any way, shape or form when he'd had a girl, an admittedly cute one at that, stay in his room overnight. He was about to bring up the subject of chakra, but Naruto beat him to the punch. "So why do you want to learn to use chakra, anyway?" His tone was casual, Sukune noticed, just as it usually was, but there was curiosity etched in there too. It felt awkward to have Naruto seated, while he was standing, almost as if he up on a stage with a microphone in hand ready to scream until his voice started croaking, and call it music, before labeling it as black metal. He was getting off topic, and Naruto looked to be getting impatient as he waited for his answer. "I don't want to be a weak link, Naruto." Sukune shoved his hands in his pockets, so he didn't fiddle with them, and look as anxious as he felt, even if he knew that Naruto probably sensed it already. "I've realized that, if I'm going to stay at this school, then I need a way to defend myself. I can't just rely on other people." Naruto rested his arms on the chair's headrest, before planting his chin down. "What made you think like that?" "Everything so far," Sukune admitted. "Then first day when Saizo confronted us, Takuruma-chan, the swimming club, Gin Senpai, the whole thing with Vegas, Ishigami, and the most recent problems we had with the committee." Sukune shot out the list of events like he was being timed for a gold medal in the Olympic Games. Naruto stared at him for a few moments, and it made Sukune shuffle on the spot slightly. Just when he thought that Naruto was trying to stare him to death, the blonde shrugged and finally allowed himself to blink. "Alright, sure, if you really want to learn how to use chakra, then I'm not going to stop you." When Sukune had thought about Naruto's reaction to his explanation, he'd expected the blonde to flat out refuse and make him earn his training like a bad remake of the Karate Kid, so it was surprising to see the only other human in the school accept his reasoning so easily. Wait, just like that. Just like that, Naruto said. Don't tell me you expected me to refuse. Before Tsukune could open his mouth, Naruto continued after snorting. As if I'd ever do something like that, I actually think that training you is a good thing. But, he leaned forwards on the chair, tilting the headdress back slightly. His expression had lost any joking or humor to it, and had been replaced by a seriousness that made Tsukune inadvertently straighten in his spot. I'll give you one warning, Tsukune, the start of this training will cause you a lot of pain. Tsukune had broken his ankle once when he'd been around 5 and running around with his cousin, back then, that had caused him so much pain that everything else had been blocked out. But, the way Naruto had said it made him feel queasy. It was almost as if a simple broken bone wouldn't even be scratching the surface of how much pain he'd be in at just the beginning. The hands in his pockets shook just like they had when Ishigami had been behind him. He remembered how Gin had came along and taken care of the former teacher, then he remembered the slaughter that had happened at the committee's HQ. I still want to learn, he said, pulling his hands into fists so they would stop shaking against his will. I still want you to teach me how to use chakra. Naruto nodded, sighed and closed his eyes. Then you might want to start preparing yourself. Before Tsukune could even begin to understand Naruto's statement, the blonde was in front of him, his hand firmly planted on his chest where kanji began to spread all along his body. Within seconds the kanji had spread and wrapped around his body like a really long strand of wire. Because we're beginning right now. That's when it started. His body became numb, as if he'd just been shot with a dosage of morphine. Unfortunately, numbness wasn't all that he received. Right where Naruto's hand was connected to his chest, a searing pain lit up like he was being burnt alive from the inside out. It started out as small as a marble, but very quickly began growing in size until every one of his blood cells felt like they were being boiled inside a pot on the oven. He went to open his mouth in a pain shout almost on instinct, but his jaw didn't so much as twitch. It started to feel like the pain was subsiding, but if that was the case, then why did his stomach twist with a really bad feeling? Tsukune got the answer in the form something similar, yet different to the pain from before. Instead of a burning feeling, he felt like his entire body was going to burst open. He could feel his intestines and just about every nerve and muscle tissue tighten and shift, as if they were being moved against their will by something. Black spots danced in his eyes. He tried to blink them away, but found out that he couldn't even do that. As he was trying to do this, he saw the computer chair that Naruto had been on looking like it was still in mid-full, but how was it even possible? Naruto had gotten off and inadvertently tipped it over so long ago. After what seemed like the worst hours he'd ever had to go through, the black spots in his vision began getting larger, connecting to others as they did so until he succumbed to complete darkness. The chair behind Naruto hit the ground, and he sighed when he saw Tsukune's dulled with pain eyes roll into the back of his head only 10 seconds after he began pumping as much chakra into his system as he could manage in a short amount of time. The other human swayed on the spot before his body began to tip backwards. Naruto grabbed the collar of his shirt before he could have an unwanted meeting with his room's floor. It worked, I think, he muttered as he hefted Tsukune's body and carried him before planting him back down onto the teen's feet. What he'd done was pretty easy to understand, really. The seal he'd used on Tsukune was, according to his father, usually something that was planted on other shinobi who had suffered injuries that caused them severe pain, such as missing limbs. It numbed the body and reduced any and all physical feeling. It was, however, only temporary, and would probably only last around a minute, 2 at most, not that the time limit would really matter in this instance with Tsukune being unconscious. After that, he'd simply began flooding his own chakra into Tsukune's chakra pathway, in order to forcibly expand his tenketsu, and allow more chakra to flow through him. Naruto had never done it before, and he hoped it worked, otherwise all the pain and stress Tsukune's body would be going through right now would have been for nothing. He stood back up and looked down at Tsukune's face, which had scrunched up in a pain grimace. You just stay there for the weekend, he said, despite knowing that Tsukune wouldn't be able to hear him. I'll be back late on Sunday to check up on you. Still going with the talking to yourself stuff, huh? Naruto twitched as he began walking out of Tsukune's room and back to his own. That's what people like me do, right? He shot back. Protagonists usually talk to themselves, so the audience understands what's going on. You're not a protagonist. Sure I am. Naruto could picture Kurama rolling his eyes. Enlighten me as to how you are then. Now you're just getting too much into it, Naruto retorted. I don't want the fourth wall to be in danger of breaking, Kurama, so I'm not saying anything more. The pretty white hallway he was walking down to get to his own room wasn't empty or silent. Students mingled in their own groups wearing anything but the school clothes. Some were entering or leaving their own rooms, and there was even a student putting a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the doorknob. He went ignored by most, but there were some students who gave him wary glances every now and then. He stopped suddenly when hostile intent began to rise from right behind him. He glanced over his shoulder to see who it was. The man stood well above 6 feet tall, easily dwarfing his own height. He had slick back blonde hair, a pair of dark eyes that bored into his own, and a rather calm face. His torso was covered by a white workout shirt, while his bottom half had a pair of sweatpants equipped. A damp towel hung loosely round his neck, and 2 dumbbells were held in his meaty hands, raised above his head in a muscle man pose. Naruto blinked. Yeah. The Hulk in human skin smirked at him, lowering the dumbbell in his right hand down while pointing his left index finger at him. Good, you were aware of me, pipsqueak. His voice was deep, making him sound more like a fully grown adult, rather than a student attending a school. The finger that had been pointed at him receded as the yokai pointed his thumb at himself, with his tone becoming proud. I'm Rikishi Chopper from the Pro Wrestling Club. Isn't that nice? Naruto remarked as he turned his head back to the front and kept on walking to his room. However, before he could get very far, he heard a squeak of "look out," and felt the anger rising in the yokai behind him. He took a step to the side just in time, to avoid getting hit by Chopper's large hand, which slammed into the spot he'd previously been in. Chopper the wrestler's face was ghastly with rage as he plucked his hand from the floor, and gave Naruto a glare. Don't shrug me off like that. He seethed, and Naruto idly wondered if his skin would start turning green. You're the one who defeated Kaio, and took down the committee, right? That's what the rumors are saying. The hallway had gone silent, and all the students were looking on with varying levels of interest. Apparently there had been some rumors going around about what had happened the day before. Naruto didn't see any reason to deny them completely. Well, it was more of a team job, actually. So you were involved then? Naruto felt his face set itself into a deadpan. Yeah, that was kinda what I was getting at. Good. Chopper's voice boomed across the hallway as students began talking amongst themselves, only with more looks sent Naruto's way than before. This is perfect. I had wanted to fight that bastard Kaio, but now I can just do away with you. Sure. Naruto said, his expression unchanging. Can we do this some other time, though? Like tomorrow or something, I have plans already. Nope. Chopper threw his dumbbells beside him, and they crashed into the floor, creating small dents. Naruto sighed in annoyance as the pro wrestler sent a vertical karate-style chop at him, as if he wanted to smash Naruto straight into the floor. Naruto easily maneuvered himself out of the way from the admittedly slow-moving attack, and grabbed Chopper's wrist with both hands in a firm grip. I said I have plans, and I suggested doing this tomorrow. Naruto moved his left foot behind him, tensed his arms, and swung the heavy form of Chopper around before letting him go, and sending the yokai straight through a wall, and into the room, that had the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the doorknob. The plaster wall gave way to Chopper's body in an instant, and Chopper's body was sent tumbling until it collided with the wardrobe in the room, that fell on him just seconds later. What the hell was that? A feminine voice yelled before there was a high-pitched squeal of surprise and fright followed by a pleasured groan. Naruto made his way through the hole that Chopper's body had caused and found 2 yokai, one male, one female, laying down on a futon covered by a blanket that the girl was hugging mostly to herself. Her face was flushed as her eyes flickered between Chopper's groaning body and Naruto. Dude. Naruto's attention went over to the male who was staring at him with half-lidded eyes. You just broke my wall. Yeah, I did. Naruto said. Sorry, but it needed to be done. He was starting to get on my nerves. The teen grunted and fell flat on his back. Whatever. He glanced at the clearly embarrassed girl beside him. Bathroom. The girl's face turned a deeper shade of scarlet, but much to Naruto's surprise, she nodded excitedly. Naruto shook his head and turned away before walking back to his own room. Milka was still there, and she had wanted to spend the day with him. Naruto had a feeling that by the time Sunday had come, Chopper would be back. That was fine, he supposed. He could do with a quick fight before going to check on Sukune later. Right now though, he was looking at the werewolf sitting across from him, idly filling his mouth with the instant ramen he'd gotten from his room. So, would you want to eat lunch with just me and no one else? On the weekends, the cafeteria would put different types of dishes up for sale. Like the current weekend, for instance, they were selling different meats: beef, lamb, pork, and so on. Naruto wasn't really interested and just grabbed some of his own food from his room, but Gin had apparently taken an interest and gotten himself a plate full of barbecued ribs. Gin swallowed the pork and put what was left of it back down on the plate with the others. Why are you saying it like that? He asked, using the serviette that had come with his lunch to wipe his hands clean. You're making it sound like I had an important topic to speak about. Can't you and I just hang out every once in a while? Yeah, we can. Naruto agreed. But this is the first time you've ever asked to have lunch with you, and the whole committee thing was just on Friday. I mean, the timing is. He trailed off when Gin sighed and pushed his plate forwards so he could put his arms on the table. Yeah, you got me, hallelujah. Gin said sarcastically, and Naruto rolled his eyes. I didn't ask you out here to chat nonsense, but it's not a grim, sad or serious subject either. It's just to save my interest. Get on with it then. Naruto said flatly. Quit rambling, senpai. Gin gave him an annoyed look before getting to his point. I just want to know what you really are. Honestly speaking, the only reason that Naruto actually cared whether anyone found out that he was a human or not was because it would cause him problems. Problems he didn't want to deal with. The Public Safety Committee was just one example. He was a human, he knew it, and he didn't want to be anything else. I'm human, senpai. I thought that you already knew this. Yeah, I did, but... The werewolf leaned forward, his reddish-violet eyes staring straight into Naruto's own. If that's true, then how can you do the things you do? No other human I've seen has ever even remotely shown anything similar to what you're capable of. There probably isn't another human alive like me. Naruto agreed, hoping he didn't sound obnoxious or cocky. I come from a different place, I guess you could say, and I just got lost. How'd you get lost? Naruto frowned. Actually, I don't really know how, I just know that this place, as well as the human world, as you call it, is nothing like where I come from. He sighed and twirled his chopsticks in what was left of his instant ramen cup. I have a gut feeling, but I don't really want to even start thinking about it. Rin didn't look very satisfied with his answers, but he didn't push the subject anymore, something Naruto was grateful for. Naruto finished up his food, and threw it in the trash can that was right near their table before standing up. Going somewhere? Rin asked. Naruto nodded and stuffed his hands in his pockets. Yeah, I need to check up on Sukune. Why? Has he been sick or something? Something like that. The walk towards the dorm rooms was boring, especially seeing as he didn't even have anyone to talk to. To his left was the forest filled with dead trees, while on his right was the wall that Saizo had punched when he threatened Naruto to stay away from Mocha. Unlike the hallway in the boys' dorm building, the path was almost completely empty, and deserted with only a few students going to and from this school. It wasn't very much longer along the path when he felt an annoyingly familiar Yuki getting closer from behind him. Apparently Chopper liked to attack his opponents from behind. He didn't get a verbal warning this time, just a clear whistling of Chopper's hand cutting through the wind, aiming at his ribs. The smirk came onto his face, perfect time to have a small skirmish, before he got to Tsukune's room. Thanks to Chopper's hand being much larger than normal, Naruto was able to see it out of his peripheral vision, and he took advantage of that by sticking his own hand out to the side, and grabbing the pro wrestler's wrist in a firm grip. Nice to see you again, Chopper. The yokai behind him released a growl, and yanked his hand free. You wouldn't be going anywhere this time, Uzumaki. The blonde turned around and took a couple of steps back, so he could look up at Chopper's face, without having to tilt his head upwards. No, I won't be. He agreed. At least not until I've kicked your ass 6 ways from today. Apparently Chopper didn't want to play around too much, for his Yuki began rising, and his body began bulging almost immediately. His shirt began getting rips throughout the stitching until it was ripped off completely, revealing a much bigger torso covered in veins. 2 of his bottom teeth protruded out of his mouth, and went above his upper lip. His slick-back blonde hair grew a line of spikes going from the front of his head all the way to the middle of his back, and 2 black horns stuck out of either side of his forehead. Show your true form to me, Uzumaki Naruto. Chopper bellowed, raising his hand up threateningly. He was much taller than before, probably reaching a height of 10 or maybe even 12 feet. Then we'll see who the strongest out of us is. Naruto hadn't really been planning on replying, but even if he had wanted to, he wouldn't have had the chance. Chopper's arm came down like a boulder, and Naruto was forced to jump out of the way as it slammed into the ground, making a nice and small crater. Gathering Senjutsu chakra had become pretty easy for him to do, and it had only been made easier and faster when Kurama had willingly become his partner. It's why he had managed to gather enough when Chopper had taken his time talking and transforming. He didn't really want to have to make the effort to use natural chakra against an admittedly weak yokai, but he didn't have enough physical strength without it to take down someone with a big and sturdy body like Chopper did. Instead of feeling tense and ready for a fight, he felt oddly calm and relaxed, as if he was at a beach and just taking in the sunlight. At the same time though, he felt as if he could go a few rounds with every yokai in the school and come out on top. My turn, he said before sprinting forward straight at Chopper. The yokai sent another chop at him, but with Naruto's much higher senses, he was able to avoid it without much trouble at all. He used Chopper's hand as a springboard and leaped off of it, launching himself straight for the pro wrestler's head. Flying through the air like this feels kinda cool. He mused but shook it off when he was close enough to his enemy's face. His hand shot forward and latched onto Chopper's forehead, his momentum causing the yokai to slide along the ground until he slammed through the wall, leaving a wide trench where his feet had dug through the earth. Uzumaki Naruto. Chopper bellowed, slamming a fist into the ground beside him, causing it to visibly crack. The damp towel that had been hung around his neck was instead left behind in the trench. Naruto released his grip on Chopper's forehead. He kneeled down just below the yokai's neck, balled his fist and raised it up. He smiled slightly. You're the one that came to me for a fight, it's not my fault you're so much weaker than Kaio. Chopper snarled, and the last thing he saw was Naruto's face before the blonde fist slammed into his nose. A loud crack resounded through the immediate area, and Naruto pulled his hand back to see he'd bent Chopper's nose to a pretty dramatic angle. He sighed and stood back up, dusting off his clothes as he did so. He spared one last glance at the unconscious yokai, before making his way back to the boys' dorm rooms. He had a human who could potentially use chakra to check up on. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want a next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. And also check out the other videos that I have created, and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.
It's not a game, it's a